The room was humming with fluorescent light when the leather crossbody bag reached my desk, sun-baked, mud-streaked, and stamped with a name that had been echoing in my files for years. I didn't open it right away. I just set a hand on that worn flap and felt the grit flake to the floor like a whisper from under the earth. Let me know where you're listening from and share this, if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Back before any of this had weight, spring mornings here started with the kind of desert chill that loosens quickly. By 9, the sun would press down on the county yards, and you'd hear weed trimmers and the rattle of chain link in every neighborhood on the east side. The courthouse lot smelled like hot asphalt and laundry soap from the jail laundry vents. It was a season for routines court at 10, coffee at 11 if the line wasn't long at the Chevron on 14th. That year, I was working a rotation of property crimes and the odd burglary that wandered in from the highways. Nothing dramatic. Nothing a pot of chili and a stack of reports couldn't carry through a quiet night shift. My apartment sat 2 miles from the station, a second-floor walk-up with a view of a palm that threw evening shadows across the stucco. The neighbor downstairs had a wind chime that would tick in the afternoon breeze, a soft sound that gave the place a heartbeat. I used to read case law at the little round table by the window until traffic thinned and the last commuter bus groaned by. Most nights I could track time by what music drifted from the sports bar down the block, old rock, early jukebox country, late. It was a reliable clock. That's what I remember most, how predictable everything felt. The county's eastern edge is a different kind of quiet, open miles low hills curled into the Mojave Joshua trees, holding the horizon like arms gone still. Most folks know those stretches by their radio dead spots and the way the wind can lift gravel into your socks. We had our share of calls out there, broken down trucks, illegal, dumping the occasional hiker who underestimated the difference between shade and no shade. If you passed the right turnout, you could see the remnant of a chain-link gate halfway up a rocky slope. Hand-painted warning signs faded to brown. Everyone swore it was sealed. Everyone knew it wasn't. I met the Brennan family first over a routine form, nothing urgent. A daughter who liked to camp and catalog old foundations and bottle shards in the ghost towns you can still find if you follow the washboards far enough. Robert Brennan. Neat handwriting, careful with dates. Linda, a softer voice, kept asking if the ranger station log was enough or if she ought to call us too, just in case. I told her the truth. I liked having more information than less, and a quick note on the date never hurt anyone. She thanked me like I was doing her a favor. I wasn't. It was habit. I never met Chloe in person, not then. I knew her from little things, her name appearing in ranger logs, a polite message forwarded to our desk asking about old mining survey records any member of the public could buy. A clerk said she sounded focused, not the show-off kind, just steady. People like that slip right into a town's rhythm. They don't jar against it. Marcus walked in once on his lunch break, grease still under his nails, and asked if there were updated maps for certain right-of-way roads heading east. He leaned on the counter, laughed with our receptionist about the heat, and repeated his question like he didn't want to trouble anyone. He had a way of smiling without showing teeth, like he was used to coaxing stubborn bolts and didn't expect the world to yield quickly. I only knew Tyler by a message in our system he wanted confirmation on where county land became federal and whether anyone would mind if he and 2 friends tested GPS mapping software on open trails. The note was precise, almost formal. People in IT write like that when they want to be understood the first time. Life rolled around them the way it rolls around everyone. Chloe picked up her parents' mail when they took a weekend to visit her aunt in the valley. Marcus tuned a neighbor's pickup until it purred low and even. Tyler drove Sarah to a diner off the highway where the pie case spun slow and the waitress topped off coffee without being asked. Saturday mornings, the hardware store kept the door propped with a cinder block, and old men with brimmed caps leaned on the counter to talk hose lengths and water bills. In the evenings, porch lights clicked on one by one, as if the neighborhood was nodding itself to sleep. The station has its own soundtrack keyboards tapping the occasional burst from the radio footsteps that tell you who's on duty without looking up. My desk faced a wall of gray file drawers that always stuck on the same 1/3 pull. The copier jammed on page 3 of every long report, and there was always a spare staple caught under the glass. These things make a place feel like a place. You don't realize how much they steady you until something moves the center. Out on the ridgeline, where the county fades into desert mornings, start with a hard brightness. You can watch heat pour off the rocks like water in July, but in April it feels lean and crisp. On some days, the light reaches into the mouth of old tunnels and rests there just long enough to show rusted rungs and collapsed timbers before the angle shifts and the dark takes back everything. The mines were skeletons there long before I started wearing a badge. We all knew their names the way kids know creek names back east. Copper Ridge, Dry Load, Gabriel's Number 4. The ground keeps stories if you let it. We had a training that spring confined space awareness, a polite way of telling deputies to stay put and wait for specialists when something yawns under your boots. We set up in a municipal garage bay and climbed ladders into a mock shaft made of scaffolding and plywood. Everyone passed. It gave me a new respect for the men and women who go where air doesn't move and walk by feel. I wrote their numbers on a yellow sticky note and kept it under my phone anyway. Some habits are the way you make sure you can breathe. My calendar that month was a row of small appointments, a pawn shop audit on Monday court on Wednesday, a neighborhood watch talk in a church hall that smelled like pine sol and cinnamon rolls on Friday. I carried index cards for questions and a stash of stickers for the grandkids folk brought along. It was all ordinary. It settled the mind. When I needed to clear my head, I drove east on County 12 until the radio hissed and the last billboard dropped behind me. There's a turnout where you can see the long slope run toward the brown hills. A few stunted trees, the kind that survive by learning to say no. The wind there carries grit like pepper, and if you stay long enough, it finds every seam in your clothes. I'd stand by the hood of my car, write my notes, and breathe until the paper felt still in my hand. The desert is good at reminding you to pay attention to small things. That was the season the Brennan porch light seemed to burn longer than usual. Some nights, leaving the station, I'd cut down their street on my way home and see it casting a neat circle on the lawn. The beam left a line across the mailbox and a shine on the curb. Linda said Robert insisted on replacing the bulb before it had the chance to dim, and you could see that no slow fade, just full brightness that stayed steady until it went out. People keep their houses in different ways. That was theirs. Jake Webb came by the office one afternoon with a box of donuts and a request for a copy of a public map. He set the box down, apologized for bringing the sugary kind, and asked if anyone preferred plain. He talked quick when he was thinking slower, when he wanted you to remember something he'd said. Even then, he gave the impression of a person who trusted his hands, someone who'd rather fix a thing than argue about it. He told us about a weekend plan to camp near the foothills and stretch his legs. He said it the way a mechanic says he'll nip a noise in the engine. Casual, confident, not careless. Sarah Collins mailed a postcard from a shop that sold seashell magnets and saltwater taffy. It ended up in our inter-office mail because she'd addressed it to the station's P.O. box instead of the person she meant to reach at home, a slip maybe, or a nerves thing. I signed it back over and sent it on. There was a pelican printed on the front and a few lines about the way the air smelled colder by the dunes than she expected. You could feel the salt in the ink where she'd pressed the pen a little too hard. On a Friday afternoon, the ranger's office faxed over a page with 3 names and a basic route. Plain form crisp letters, boxes checked in the right places. No request for escorts. No panic. I initialed the corner because it was habit to mark anything that touched a mine or a cave just so I knew it had passed in front of me. I slipped it into the file drawer that only opened clean if you tugged left before pulling. The paper slid in with the soft sound of something that expected to be read and put away. That night, the heat stayed soft, not the kind that sticks. Kids chalked hopscotch grids on the sidewalks outside the apartments across from the station. Someone grilled in a small backyard, and the smell of charcoal drifted down the alley and settled like a blanket. I walked the row of patrol cars and checked that each had a first aid bag tucked behind the driver's seat, a reflex born from a case long before this one. The bags were there zippered tight. I locked the trunk and touched the badge pinned just left of center on my shirt the way I always do before heading home. On the way, I rolled down the window. The air had the clean taste it gets before a change in weather. The sky over the ridgeline turned bruised purple, and a single star pushed through where the light led it. I don't remember what song was playing on the radio. I remember the quick snap of the turn signal and the way my tires whispered across the painted lines when I eased into the drive. Sometime later hours at most, my phone lit on the nightstand and stopped before I could reach it. Not a ring, just that brief glow, then dark. I listened to the apartment settle the wind chime downstairs, barely stirring. Outside, along a quiet street on the east side of town, a porch light held steady against an empty stretch of road. It washed the curb in a pale, patient circle and kept shining long after the hour it was meant to say, "Welcome home." By morning, the Brennan porch light was still on bright as if it had been waiting all night. In the station lot, a thin coat of dust lay over the patrol hoods, and the day started like any other. Somewhere past the ridgeline, the wind pressed against a chain-link gate, and the metal gave a tired rattle like a breath held too long. The morning the call came in, I was halfway through my first cup of coffee, the kind that tastes like metal after sitting too long on a warmer. Dispatch said a family was requesting a welfare check near Copper Ridge, 3 adults overdue from a day trip at the old mine site. I didn't have to ask which one. That ridge had been breathing trouble since before I joined the department. I looked out the office window, saw the haze already rising over the desert, and felt the quiet click of something settling into place. By the time I reached the ranger station, the Brennans were waiting out front, their pickup idling under the only patch of shade in the lot. Robert stood beside it, his jaw set hard enough to ache, while Linda sat in the cab clutching a phone that wouldn't ring. I'd seen that posture before, the way people hold themselves right before hope and panic start fighting for space. The logbook showed their daughter Chloe, and her 2 friends, Marcus Webb and Tyler Novak, had signed in early the previous morning. They'd marked the Copper Ridge Access Road standard entry and expected return around dusk. No checkout signature, no radio contact, no vehicle movement since. Rangers had already driven past the entrance gate and confirmed the truck was still there, doors locked, supplies in the bed. I remember how quiet the station went when that detail landed. Nobody said it, but everyone knew the pattern. That mine had taken people before, though never anyone as well prepared as those 3. I followed the ranger convoy out along the dirt road, our tires kicking pale dust that hung in the rear view like smoke. The closer we got, the more the landscape folded into itself, boulders scattered like old bones, the air dry enough to sting. The mine mouth sat halfway up the hill, a rusted frame of metal and chain link giving the illusion of order. The sun was still high when we found their truck pulled just off the road. A folding table sat behind it, a pair of camp chairs, and 2 sandwiches hardened at the edges from the heat. Their cooler was unopened drinks, still cold. It felt like the kind of scene you find when someone steps away for a moment and just never comes back. We started with the obvious calling into the shaft, tracing boot prints, checking for any secondary trails. The footprints led inward, overlapping 3 sets, moving with purpose. Inside the first chamber, the air cooled sharply, carrying that iron taste you get when stone hasn't seen daylight in decades. Our headlamps swept over old timbers, twisted rebar graffiti faded to ghosts. Every tunnel split in 2, then 4. We dropped markers and flagged turns, careful to record each junction. You learn early in this work that underground distance lies. 100 feet can stretch to eternity when you don't know what waits ahead. By midnight, we had teams rotating in and out, mapping the accessible sections. The rescue units from neighboring counties arrived with oxygen sensors and ground-penetrating radar, the kind of equipment we don't usually need unless something's gone badly wrong. They found signs of recent passage scuffed dust, a candy wrapper, still shiny boot marks that trailed into darkness. Each one felt like a voice calling from just beyond reach. When we regrouped at dawn, faces were gray with fatigue and dust. Nobody wanted to say what they were thinking, so we stuck to logistics, expanding search sectors, checking ventilation shafts, sending drones as far as the signal would allow. The Brennans came back that morning, standing just beyond the tape. Linda kept handing out bottles of water to whoever was closest, as if hydration could fix the world. Robert didn't speak much, just stared at the mine entrance with a look I'd seen on other fathers, the kind that says he'd crawl through every inch of earth if someone would only tell him where to start. Jake Webb showed up by noon, restless energy bottled tight. He asked if we'd checked the lower tunnels, the ones with restricted stenciled across the doors. I told him we had specialists for that, and he nodded, though I could see the tremor in his jaw. For days we combed that mountain. Search crews marked every accessible shaft, recording oxygen levels, testing for gases. Some sections were too unstable to enter. Others ended in collapses that looked fresh, even though the mine had been dormant for half a century. Each night we'd emerge into the cool air and watch the desert swallow the light, then return to our base camp, where the maps multiplied faster than progress. It's a peculiar kind of helplessness, knowing people are somewhere beneath your boots, and that the space between you might as well be miles of ocean. By the end of the second week, the reports all started to sound the same. No new footprints, no signal beacons, no heat signatures. The probability models flattened to zero. Officially, we shifted from rescue to recovery, though the families never used that word. They refused to hold any memorials, just candlelight vigils near the fence. The press moved on. The volunteers thinned, and the mine went quiet again. In law enforcement, you learn to live with unfinished stories. But that one stuck. Every few months, someone would call about a light spotted in the hills or a sound from the tunnels, and we'd check knowing what we wouldn't find. Still you go. You always go. 6 years passed before the desert spoke again. That morning I was back in the office, different desk, same fluorescent hum. The call came from a geological survey team routine mapping of unstable areas out by Copper Ridge. They'd found something lodged behind a rockfall about 2 miles in. The foreman's voice was measured but tight. Looks like a bag, detective. Leather. You'll want to see the name. I drove out there myself, the road rough as ever, the mine gate now covered in new warning signs that never seemed to keep anyone out. The surveyors met me with dust on their clothes and a nervous politeness like they'd disturbed a grave. One of them held out a clear evidence bag. Inside, the leather crossbody was cracked and gray, the stitching half gone. Even before I read the embossed letters, I knew. The gold was faded, but it was there, Chloe Brennan. The air in the tunnel felt heavier that day, close enough to taste. We cleared the immediate area, documenting the find, then widened the perimeter to assess the collapse that had sealed it in. The bag had been wedged in a narrow gap between boulders, protected just enough to survive. Inside, a small notebook, wrapped in a plastic pouch, still sealed tight. I remember holding it under my flashlight and seeing the ghost of handwriting through the translucent cover. A name repeated on the first line, neat and deliberate. It's a strange thing, touching something that's traveled through both time and desperation. Back at the station, I logged the evidence myself. Procedure says chain of custody, first analysis later, but I admit I read that journal before the ink had a chance to dry from the signature forms. The pages started like any adventurer's record notes on gear sketches of tunnel maps, lists of coordinates. Then the tone shifted. I could feel it even before the words spelled it out. Lines grew shorter, pressure heavier on the paper. There were mentions of an unmapped passage, a narrow crawl that led to a cavern filled with bones and old mining tools, and later crates of copper sealed under rock. She wrote about excitement, First the sense of discovery of history in her hands, but the entries tightened quickly into fear. A collapse trapped air, the sudden silence of separation from the world. I stopped reading halfway through that first night, sat with my elbows on the desk, listening to the hum of the lights overhead. The words had weight, not just fear, but order, the kind of detail you keep only when you know someone else might need to find you. I closed the book and looked at her name again, feeling the strange pull between grief and duty. We'd found the first true piece of them in 6 years, and it was a story written from inside the dark. The next day, we coordinated with county engineers to re-enter the section safely. Mapping crews traced the same routes Chloe described, confirming the collapsed passage that had sealed them in. It took hours to clear debris enough to see the chamber beyond. Our searchlight swept across a space larger than expected walls, streaked with mineral veins. The ground scattered with rusted tools and a scattering of bones we later confirmed belonged to animals, at least most of them. The air was dry, still untouched. You could almost hear her footsteps echoing back through time. We sealed the chamber again once the survey concluded, pending a full recovery operation. Back above ground, the desert light felt harsh after hours below. I briefed the families that evening. Robert sat stone still as I explained what we'd found. Linda listened, hands clasped, eyes focused on the table like she could will the rest of the story to appear. Jake's questions came quick, practical: how deep, how long, what next? I told him we'd proceed carefully, that the area was unstable, that we'd keep him informed. He nodded once, but his expression said he'd already made his own plan. That night I stayed late at the station reading deeper into the journal. The handwriting grew worse, as if written in low light strokes, shaky from exhaustion. The story unfolded: days of rations, failed attempts to dig through debris, efforts to signal by light and sound. She wrote about Marcus taking charge, about Tyler trying to map alternate exits, about hope thinning as water did. Each entry was a step deeper into the impossible. The final pages I couldn't finish. Not yet. When I finally closed the notebook, dawn was breaking outside. The office was quiet, only the low buzz of an old vending machine and the faint rustle of paper in the air vent. I looked at the leather bag sealed in evidence plastic, thought of her hands clutching it, and realized how much of this job is built on other people's last attempts to be found. The desert would keep its secrets a little longer, but it had already started to speak, and I knew then that the truth, whatever it was, waited just beyond the reach of that last collapsed tunnel. I didn't sleep much after reading those first pages. The kind of exhaustion that follows a story like that isn't physical. It sits in the chest, heavy and unmovable. By dawn, the edges of the desert had turned the color of burnt copper, and I was back in my office staring at Chloe's journal sealed in its evidence bag. I'd told myself I was just reviewing notes before the forensics team arrived, but what I was really doing was buying time, trying to gather enough distance between her words and what they meant. 6 years of theories had just been replaced by a record written by someone who never made it back to daylight. And I could feel it. There was more buried in those pages than anyone wanted to believe. When the technicians came in, they handled the notebook like a living thing. Gloves, humidity control, high-resolution scans. The lab confirmed what we'd already suspected: the pages had been protected by that plastic seal, preserved enough that every line could be read. I gave them clearance to process it, but I stayed nearby. There's something about holding an object like that, knowing the last hands to touch it were trembling, knowing they left it behind, not by choice, but because time ran out. That afternoon, the press caught wind of the discovery. They set up outside the station, cameras glinting under the noon sun. I kept the statement brief. Evidence recovered. Investigation reopened. No further comment. The Brennans came in later through the side door, the kind of quiet entrance people make when they know the world's watching. Linda carried a folder of old photos, as if she needed to remind herself that her daughter had been a person, not just a name in a headline. Robert asked one question. "Does it say anything about the boys?" And I told him we were still reading. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. I had already seen enough to know this story didn't end clean. Over the next few days, I went through the journal line by line. The handwriting changed from steady to uneven, the spacing between words widening as the ink thinned. She'd written about the second day inside the mine when they found that narrow, unmapped passageway branching off the main shaft. It wasn't on any of the old surveys or maps we'd checked years ago. Chloe described it as a crack in the rock barely wide enough to crawl through, the kind of thing you'd miss unless you were looking straight at it. They had hesitated, argued even, but curiosity won. I could almost hear her voice as I read, excited, nervous, but hopeful. The way she wrote about that first cavern made my skin crawl. She called it the hollow room, said the floor was littered with bones, animals she thought, though she wasn't sure. She'd sketched them, long curved, tangled. She described the smell, old dust and metal, something chemical. Marcus's metal detector had gone off constantly in there, the readings climbing so high they thought the device might be broken. They dug with their hands and found the copper ingots, first smooth heavy, wrapped in oilcloth. That discovery should have been triumph, but in her words, you could feel the air tighten. She wrote that the walls felt alive, like the sound was vibrating through the stone. Then came the collapse. A sound like thunder, she said, and the tunnel they'd crawled through disappeared behind a wall of rock. The first entries after that were still organized. She documented their supplies, how many bottles of water, how many protein bars, how many flashlight batteries. But soon her lists turned into fragments. Marcus coughing, Tyler scraping his knuckles bloody on stone, a drip of water somewhere they couldn't reach. She drew small diagrams showing where they'd tried to dig, marking each failed attempt with an X. And then one line underlined twice. The air feels heavy now. I paused, reading there. It was the kind of note that tells you more than it says. I'd been in collapsed spaces before, car wrecks, basements, after explosions. You know, when the oxygen starts to thin, it changes how you think, how you write. Her next few entries were scattered between moments of hope and despair. They'd tried signaling by light tapping metal against rock in rhythmic bursts, hoping rescue teams might hear. They rationed their food, took turns resting. For a while, it sounds like they believed someone would find them. Then the tone shifted again. Tyler found another passage deeper in the cavern, one that carried a faint current of air. That single detail, moving air, became everything to them. She wrote about the three of them packing what little they had left and following it through a maze of older tunnels. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. She described wooden supports blackened with age tools that predated the copper mine clothing fragments half buried in silt. I recognized the pattern immediately. The early miners had expanded old shafts from the 19th century, using them as shortcuts. The official maps never included them because the records were spotty and most were considered collapsed decades before. But they weren't. Not completely. As I read, I could almost see them walking by flashlight, their beams carving through layers of history that no one had touched in 100 years. She wrote about skulls tucked behind rocks, bones arranged as if someone had hidden them deliberately. It wasn't an accident, she said. It feels like someone meant for it to stay secret. Her words started to lose structure after that. The lines slanted. Sentences trailed off. She was dehydrated, starving, and still documenting everything, trying to leave a map for whoever came after. Around this time, word of the journal's content leaked. A reporter claimed the county had evidence of historical crimes tied to the mine. By the next morning, every local station was outside the gates. Some called it a ghost story, others a cover-up. The truth was simpler and worse. We didn't know what we were looking at yet. What we did know was that those tunnels were older, deeper, and more dangerous than we ever realized. We brought in a federal geological team to assess stability. They scanned sections of the ridge and found voids, large pockets of space extending beyond mapped boundaries. That explained why the original search had failed. The rescuers had never even been close to the chamber where Chloe wrote her last words. We arranged for a controlled entry using new safety gear and air monitors, but I'll admit I hesitated. There's something inhuman about going into a place that's already proven it doesn't want you there. During that same stretch, Jake Webb returned. He'd been quiet for years, working nights at his brother's old shop. When he came into my office, he looked thinner eyes, red around the edges, but steady. "You found her words," he said, not asking, just stating it. I nodded. He asked if he could read them. I told him no, that it wasn't safe for the original copy to leave evidence control. He accepted that with the kind of silence that cuts deeper than anger. Before he left, he said, "If she mapped anything, I'll find it." And I believed him. Over the next few weeks, we worked side by side with the survey team, aligning Chloe's sketches with the ground-penetrating scans. Her drawings weren't perfect, but the orientation matched enough to build a rough path. It was hauntingly precise for someone who'd been trapped in the dark. Her notes marked turns, water trickles, even air currents. I realized then she hadn't just been writing to stay sane, she'd been building a message, a trail. When we finally breached the section, she described the air shifted. Even through masks, it had a taste, old stone and copper, something stale that clung to your throat. The beam of my flashlight hit a wall, carved, smooth-lined with beams that didn't match 20th century work. On the floor were rusted tools and the remnants of what looked like mining crates. A chill ran through the team when we found the stenciled markings, names, dates, quantities. It wasn't a legend. The ore she'd described was real, and so were the other things, the skeletal remains tucked between rocks long forgotten, each one telling a story that ended in violence. That night, I went home but didn't turn on the lights. I sat at the kitchen table listening to the hum of the refrigerator and thinking about how thin the line is between curiosity and fate. Those three went in chasing history, and history took them in return. But I also knew Chloe's journal hadn't finished its story yet. The last pages were waiting sealed and brittle, and I wasn't sure I wanted to read them. Still, the next morning I did. The ink was faded, the handwriting almost illegible. She wrote about finding another chamber, one with signs of human habitation. Beds, tools, even papers sealed in metal boxes. She mentioned a name, Heinrich Vulkar, a supervisor from the 1950s. He wasn't missing copper, as old rumors claimed. He'd found the same tunnels they had and turned them into something else entirely. She described his journals, his notes about dealing with trespassers, about using the caves to hide stolen goods, maybe even people. Her tone shifted from fear to disbelief, then back to something like resignation. She'd realized what she'd stumbled into, an underground record of crimes spanning decades. I remember leaning back in my chair after finishing those lines, the words blurring together in the low light. The story wasn't just about three friends lost in a mine anymore. It was about the hundreds who never made it out, their bones scattered through the tunnels, their names buried with the ore. It was history finally clawing its way to the surface. Outside my window, the sun was setting over the ridge. The air looked clear, but I knew it wasn't. It never really is in that part of the desert. Dust holds memory. It keeps the scent of old metal, the echo of collapsed stone. And as I watched the light fade, I realized the mine wasn't done speaking. It had waited 60 years to be heard, and now that it had started, it wasn't going to stop. The week after I finished reading Chloe's final entries, I stopped sleeping altogether. I'd close my eyes and see light flickering off stone, hear her pencil scraping over paper in the dark, that steady rhythm of someone trying to leave proof they existed. Every line she wrote had been measured against time, every word carved out of fear and duty. I'd read a lot of case journals in my career, suicides, hostage notes, field diaries, but none of them felt like this. This one carried the sound of someone's breath fading as they wrote. We began our second descent before sunrise, the air cool enough to bite through the suits. Engineers had reinforced the main access with steel framing, but the mountain still groaned when the wind shifted. I led the entry team through the same route where the surveyors had found her bag passing markers left during our last sweep. The dust hung thick and the beam from my lamp caught motes that looked like ash suspended in air. It felt wrong to speak down there. Every sound bounced back too quickly, like the mountain wanted its silence intact. We reached the sealed corridor where the journal said the collapse had started. The rock was loose but stable enough for a narrow passage. Our boots sank into old sediment layered with rust flakes, each step sending a dull echo into the dark. About 50 feet in the tunnel opened into a cavern wider than any we'd mapped before. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It wasn't just cool air, but a deep mineral cold that seeped straight into the skin. I raised my light and saw the outlines she'd described, the crates, the equipment, the copper veins still catching what little reflection our lamps offered. It was exactly as she'd written it, only quieter. Near the center lay a pile of tools, picks, shovels, lantern glass, long clouded over. One of the crew whispered that it looked staged, like someone had set it there for us to find. We kept moving, careful not to disturb the scene. A few yards beyond, we found what she'd called the bone chamber. The ground dipped into a depression littered with skeletal remains. Some were animals scattered and fractured. Others weren't. The forensic tech beside me just lowered his light without a word. I counted at least a dozen human skulls before I stopped trying. It was impossible to tell how old they were by sight alone, but the presence of boots, buckles, and shreds of canvas told me this wasn't ancient history. We set up cameras and markers, documenting everything, every angle. I tried to focus on the process, the sequence, the order that keeps your hands from shaking, but when I saw the narrow path leading deeper into the rock, the same one she said she took alone, I felt something twist in my chest. She had walked that way with no backup, no gear, no light, but a dying flashlight, and still found the will to keep writing. We followed her trail, the passage narrowing to where we had to crouch. The walls changed there, less raw stone, more cut and shaped like the tunnels had been extended by hand. We found beams etched with markings, tally lines carved deep into the wood. I brushed my glove across one and felt splinters catch. The lines weren't measurements, they were counts. We found hundreds of them. The next chamber was worse. A makeshift room framed with scavenged timber, a rusted cot pushed against one wall. A table half collapsed sat beside a crate that had burst open, spilling yellowed pages across the ground. It took a minute for my light to find the name stamped on the first one, H. Volker. I'd read the name in Chloe's journal, but seeing it down there printed in his own hand hit differently. The pages were filled with cramped writing lists, ledgers, notes on shipments and repairs. And then it turned darker mentions of the watchers, the ones who saw too much, and coded references to disposals. It didn't read like fiction. It read like a man keeping score. We found what was left of him sitting in a chair at the far end of the room, a skeleton folded forward over a desk. The glasses still hung by one ear, the pen corroded between bony fingers. He'd died exactly where he'd worked. Behind him, a small oil lamp lay on its side, long burned out. I stood there a long time imagining that last night writing until the air turned thick and the dark swallowed the flame. His journal described how he'd taken over these tunnels after the mine shut down, turning them into a refuge, and later into something much worse, a hiding place for stolen goods, and a grave for anyone who stumbled onto it. When we cleared the debris around the desk, one of the techs found a broken pocket watch. Inside, under the shattered glass, a small photograph was folded tight, a man, a woman, and a child in front of a porch. I kept that image in my head as we packed up the remains. Somewhere long before he became the ghost of this mine, Volker had been someone's family. It didn't excuse anything, but it made the silence around him heavier. We pressed on into the next shaft where Chloe's final entries had placed her. The tunnel climbed sharply, leading toward a vertical chimney that stretched high enough to catch faint drafts. At the base, we found signs of struggle claw marks on the rock, the broken remnants of rope, and a small pile of items that had belonged to her, a flashlight, the casing corroded, a pen, the lid of a plastic water bottle, 10 feet farther in, we found her. She was lying on her side near a flat stone, arms crossed around her bag as though she'd gone to sleep that way. The light from our headlamps touched the edge of her face shield, dust crystallized along the seams of her jacket. There was no panic in the position of her body, no sign of injury. It looked like her body had simply surrendered. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the rescue techs whispered, "She made it farther than anyone thought." I knelt beside her and checked the coordinates. It matched exactly to the map she'd drawn in her journal, the same one she'd left behind for us to follow. I remember saying quietly, "You did it, kid. You really did." The others pretended not to hear, giving me space to collect myself. We photographed the scene, recorded every detail, then began the long process of bringing her home. By the time we reached the surface, the sun was setting again. The desert looked untouched, the mine mouth silent except for the low whistle of wind. We covered the entrance, marked it for closure, and called the families. I stayed until the last light faded. There's a kind of peace that settles after a recovery, not relief exactly, but the end of not knowing. In the days that followed, the investigation widened. The FBI joined once we confirmed the evidence of long-term criminal activity underground. Forensic anthropologists cataloged dozens of remains, each linked to a different time period. Miners, wanderers, maybe even missing travelers from as far back as the 1920s. Volker's journals painted a picture of a network that used the tunnels for smuggling, theft, and eventually murder. The deeper they dug, the more names surfaced, each one leading to another disappearance long thought unrelated. I spent hours rereading Chloe's words, matching them against our findings. Every direction she'd written, every distance had been precise. Her last coherent entry ended with that line about the stars, the one we all assumed was hallucination. But when we traced the chimney she described, we found an opening near the ridge above, barely the size of a basketball. If you lay in that exact spot and shined a light upward, the cracks in the rock formed a scatter of pinpoints against the sky. She hadn't been hallucinating. She'd been looking at the real thing, stars just barely visible through the mountain. That discovery stayed with me. She'd died only a few hundred feet below the surface, close enough to see the night she was trying to reach. It felt cruel, but also extraordinary. Even at the end, she was still observing, still recording what she saw. We recovered Marcus and Tyler 2 days later in the same chamber she'd described as their resting place. Their positions told a story that didn't need words. Marcus slumped near the wall where he'd been digging, Tyler beside him, his hands folded across his chest. Their gear was arranged carefully, tools stacked, headlamps aligned like they'd tried to leave order in the middle of chaos. We brought them up together, 3 friends finally reunited in daylight. Afterward, I filed my report and drove out to the ridge one last time. The county had already started sealing the entrances with concrete, posting federal warnings. The place looked smaller now, almost harmless, but I knew better. Under that slope was a century of secrets, greed, survival, and a young woman's courage carved into the stone itself. I sat on the hood of my truck until the light turned that deep Mojave red. Somewhere behind me, wind shifted through the chain-link fence and made it rattle like it had that first night 6 years ago. It sounded less like warning now and more like breath, as if the mountain was finally exhaling. There was still work to do, identifying remains, tracing old records, connecting names to the crimes Volker had documented. But in that moment, standing on the edge of the desert, I wasn't thinking about evidence or procedure. I was thinking about how Chloe had kept writing when everyone else would have given up, how she'd left behind not just a record of death, but a map of truth. Before leaving, I placed a marker stone near the entrance, a habit I'd picked up from rescue teams. It wasn't official. Just a small thing, a promise. The inscription was simple, light found. Then I turned back toward the highway, the last of the daylight brushing the tops of the hills, and for the first time in years, the ridge looked still. But even from that distance, I swear I could see a faint glimmer from the rocks, like the stars she'd written about were answering back. When the dust finally settled around Copper Ridge, the desert seemed quieter than I remembered. The wind still came down off the hills at dusk, stirring the fence line, but it felt softer somehow, as if the mountain had let go of a long-held breath. The tunnels were sealed by then, every known entrance poured with concrete warning signs bolted into place by the Bureau and the county. The work crews packed up the floodlights, came down, and one by one the trucks left. For the first time in years, that stretch of land went dark again, the way it probably looked before anyone ever struck copper there. The recovery phase lasted months. The forensic teams cataloged every remain, every bone fragment, every scrap of evidence tied to the crimes buried beneath those rocks. They identified 13 victims in total, miners, drifters, and people who'd vanished without a headline between 1918 and 1956. Some still don't have names. The records they found in Heinrich Volker's journals confirmed what we already knew. He'd inherited a network of tunnels once used for smuggling and had kept them alive through theft, extortion, and murder. He'd used the mine like a vault, part burial ground, part hideout, part monument to his own control. When the report went public, the headlines called it the Century Mine Murders, but the families, both old and new, called it something else. They called it closure. It wasn't perfect, but it was something solid to stand on after years of imagining what might have been. The Brennans held a memorial service near the ridge that spring. I remember the day clearly. The sun was high and the desert light was so bright it bleached the color out of everything: flowers, fabric, even skin. Linda stood at the podium holding Chloe's journal, the restored copy we'd given her once the forensic work was done. She read a passage from the early pages when the writing still carried that spark of adventure. Her voice caught once, but she finished every word. Robert didn't speak. He stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder, eyes fixed on the horizon. A small crowd gathered, friends, reporters, a few of us from the department. There were no speeches about justice or God's will, just silence. Afterward, Linda handed me a folded note that said, "Thank you for bringing her home." I kept that note tucked in the back of my casebook for a long time. Jake Webb spent that summer helping the search teams catalog evidence. It wasn't his job. He just showed up with a shovel and steady hands. He said it felt right to finish what his brother started. When we finally recovered, Marcus and Tyler Jake was the one who insisted on helping carry them to the extraction lift. Later, he told me that standing in that tunnel, breathing the same air his brother once breathed, was the first time he felt peace. He doesn't come around the station anymore, but every year on the anniversary, a bouquet of desert marigolds appears by the memorial stone. No card, no message, just the flowers. As for me, the case changed something fundamental. You don't walk through a place like that and come back exactly the same. I'd spent decades working crimes above ground, murders, robberies, fraud. But this one was different. It was older than all of us, layered like sediment, one secret pressed against another. For months afterward, I'd wake up before dawn and catch myself listening, half expecting to hear that faint echo from the tunnels, the sound of stone shifting under weight. It wasn't fear. It was memory. The kind that never stops whispering once it finds a place to live inside you. The FBI's investigation stretched into 2 years. They traced Volker's associates' uncovered accounts and confirmed that his operations had fed into larger smuggling rings that once ran through the Southwest. Most of the people responsible were long dead. Justice, in the traditional sense, was impossible. What remained was truth, ugly, detailed, unarguable truth. And in our line of work, that's sometimes the best you can give. Chloe's journal became the cornerstone of the case. The families decided to donate it along with the recovered artifacts to the county museum. They built a small exhibit called Echoes Below, set in a quiet corner near the geology wing. The display is simple: her leather bag, the flashlight, one of Marcus's tools, and the restored notebook open to that final line, "I can see the stars." The first time I saw it, I stood there longer than I meant to. A few people passed behind me, whispering about the bravery it must have taken to keep writing in the dark. I didn't correct them. They were right. I still keep a copy of her hand-drawn map on my desk. It's not official evidence anymore, but it reminds me that investigation isn't just about finding what's hidden. It's about listening to what's left behind. Every turn, every arrow, every little note she made became a voice louder than any statement ever filed in court. She left a path through the dark, and all we had to do was follow it. The county eventually declared the mine a protected site, both crime scene and historical landmark. Access is restricted now, no tours, no filming, no new exploration. Some people protested, saying it should be reopened as a cautionary tale, a lesson in greed and survival. But I've always believed some places earn their silence. Copper Ridge is one of them. We've already taken enough from it. A year after the closure, I visited the Brennans one last time. Their house looked the same modest, well-kept a porch light that still burned long past dusk. They'd turned Chloe's old room into a reading space filled with books on geology and archaeology, subjects she loved. Linda said she volunteers at the community college now, teaching mine safety workshops for amateur explorers. Robert helps maintain the hiking trails outside town. They don't talk about their daughter's last days, only the life that came before. I think that's their way of keeping her alive. Sometimes I drive past the ridge on patrol out of habit. The desert doesn't change much out there. The sand shifts, the wind paints new lines, but the bones of the land stay the same. Every so often, a flash of light will catch on the hills a reflection off some old metal still buried beneath the surface, and for half a second it looks like a signal. I don't believe in ghosts, not really, but I believe the past has a way of reaching out. The official file sits on my shelf now, thick as a dictionary. Every report, every photo, every statement. When I read through it, what strikes me most isn't the violence or the mystery, it's the persistence. Chloe's handwriting never wavered even at the end. She documented every step, every sound, every small moment of hope. She faced a darkness that swallowed generations before her and still left a light behind for us to find. It's strange how a story like that changes the shape of a place. People still drive by the ridge, but no one goes in anymore. The mine isn't an adventure spot or a legend. It's a memorial now, even without a sign saying so. Locals leave stones at the fence line, each one painted with a name or a word. Strength, courage, home. The wind scatters sand over them, but they stay like breadcrumbs across the desert floor. In the years since I've taken other cases, but none linger the same way. Maybe because this one reminded me that truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits quiet, patient, buried deep enough that only time can uncover it. And sometimes the people who find it aren't looking for justice at all. They're just trying to understand what really happened to someone they loved, or to a stranger who deserved to be remembered. Every time I open a new case file, I think about those tunnels. About how darkness can last for decades and still not win. About a young woman who refused to disappear quietly. About a mountain that finally gave back what it took. I keep her map pinned on the wall above my desk. It's faded now, the paper curling at the edges, but the lines are still clear enough to follow if you know what you're looking for. I like to think that's what she wanted, for someone to keep looking, not just for her, but for every voice that went unheard. Sometimes I stop by the museum after hours when it's quiet. The staff knows me by name and lets me walk through without turning on the full lights. The exhibit glows softly in the dark. Her handwriting, small, deliberate, sits behind the glass, the words steady as ever. Visitors leave small notes on the wall beside it. You're not forgotten. Thank you for your courage. Rest now. I stand there until the night guard gives me that polite nod that means closing time. And when I step outside into the desert air, it always feels a little lighter, as if the ground itself is finally breathing easy. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for noise, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because remembering is the one thing that keeps the light alive.